Some wounds do not scream when they happen. They whisper. They arrive dressed as a conversation, a misunderstanding, a look across the room, a sentence spoken in a calm voice that somehow leaves your whole body shaking. That is what makes them so dangerous. If someone had screamed at you, if they had slammed the door, if they had shattered something you could point to, at least your mind would know where to place the blame. But what do you do when the person who broke you did it softly? What do you do when they smiled while they erased you? What do you do when the one who wounded you most deeply still looks perfectly fine to the world? That is where this story begins. Not in the chaos, but after it. In the silence that comes later. In the moment when the phone screen goes dark, the room is still, and yet your heart will not slow down. In the moment when you realize something inside you has been disturbed so deeply that even your own thoughts no longer feel like a safe place to rest. Sophia sat alone in her apartment in Chicago, the city lights flickering across the glass like distant signals from a world that suddenly felt unreachable. Her phone had stopped vibrating minutes ago, but she was still staring at it, frozen, as if one more message might finally explain what had just happened. Her chest was tight. Her throat was dry. Her mind kept replaying the conversation, not because it was loud, but because it was so quiet. That was the terrifying part. No explosion. No obvious threat. No dramatic betrayal anyone else would recognize as abuse. Just a few carefully chosen words. A shift in tone. A subtle turn of blame. And somehow, by the end of it, she was apologizing for being hurt. Again. That is the wound nobody prepares you for. The wound you cannot explain. The wound that does not just break your heart. It breaks your confidence in your own mind. Because when someone hurts you openly, you know you have been hurt. But when someone hurts you while sounding logical, controlled, even kind, the damage goes deeper than pain. It enters the place where certainty used to live. It touches your judgment. Your memory. Your instincts. Your sense of what is real. And little by little, without fully realizing it, you stop asking, why would they do this to me, and start asking, what is wrong with me that this keeps happening? That is how the trap closes. Not all at once. Not in a single night. But slowly. Elegantly. Almost invisibly. You begin to second-guess your own reactions. You rehearse simple conversations in your head before speaking. You rewrite your texts 3 times so you will not sound too emotional. You apologize for your tone when the issue was their cruelty. You explain yourself to exhaustion, hoping that if you just find the right words, the right timing, the right softness, the right amount of patience, then the truth will finally be enough. But with a narcissist, truth is never enough when the truth threatens their control. And that is what makes this kind of pain feel so haunting. It is not just heartbreak. It is not just betrayal. It is not even just emotional exhaustion. It is a kind of internal desecration. Something sacred in you was handled without reverence. Your trust. Your loyalty. Your sincerity. Your willingness to see the best in someone. The parts of you that were beautiful, generous, tender, and deeply human were not protected. They were studied. They were used. They were turned into openings through which manipulation entered your life. They weaponized your goodness. That is why this pain feels different. That is why it echoes at strange hours. That is why you can be driving down a freeway in broad daylight, hear one phrase in your head, and suddenly feel your stomach drop like you are back in the same emotional prison. Because your soul knows this was not a normal injury. You were not merely misunderstood. You were handled by someone who needed your confusion in order to feel powerful. And now comes the part that shocks people most. The one who caused all of this often seems untouched. They sleep. They laugh. They post photos. They charm new people. They gather sympathy. They tell a polished version of the story in which they are the victim, the misunderstood one, the strong one, the reasonable one. Meanwhile, you are left carrying the invisible wreckage, trying to explain a kind of suffering that does not leave fingerprints. That is why so many survivors feel isolated even in a crowded room. They are living inside an injury no one else can fully see. The world notices what bleeds publicly. It knows what to do with visible damage. But it does not always know what to do with the person who says, "I do not know how to explain it. I just do not feel like myself anymore." And yet that may be the most honest sentence of all. Because this kind of wound does not simply hurt your feelings. It interferes with your inner world. It disrupts the natural relationship between your intuition and your voice. It teaches your nervous system to hesitate before trusting what it knows. It makes you suspicious of your own clarity. It can even make peace feel unfamiliar for a while, because chaos was repeated so often it began to feel normal. If that has happened to you, hear this clearly: your pain is not an overreaction. Your confusion is not weakness. Your grief is not proof that you were foolish. It is proof that something deep was touched. Something real. Something sacred. And that is exactly why this story does not end where most people think it does. Because the narcissist may have walked away from the conversation. They may have walked away from the relationship. They may have walked away from the scene they created with their image still intact. But they did not walk away from reality. They did not step outside the reach of truth. They did not outsmart the moral structure of existence itself. They may have escaped your explanation. They may have escaped your confrontation. They may have escaped human accountability for a season. But no one escapes what happens when they build their life by violating truth, distorting reality, and feeding on the trust of another human soul. That is the mystery at the heart of this message. What if the pain you are carrying is not the end of the story, but the beginning of an unveiling? What if the silence that made you feel abandoned is actually where a deeper justice begins? What if the one who looked untouchable has already stepped into consequences they cannot yet see? Stay with me, because what happens next is not ordinary revenge. It is deeper than revenge. More precise than revenge. More unsettling than revenge. And once you understand it, you will never again mistake temporary appearances for final outcomes. If this kind of message speaks to something deep in you, subscribe to the channel and support this community. Your support helps us keep creating powerful videos that bring clarity, healing, and truth to the people who need it most. Now I want to ask you something simple, and I want you to answer in the comments with just one letter. When someone keeps hurting you but always sounds calm and convincing, which feels more familiar? A. You leave the conversation angry at them. B. You leave the conversation doubting yourself. Comment A or B below. Why narcissists seem untouchable at first. What makes a narcissist so dangerous in the beginning is not cruelty. It is credibility. That is the part almost nobody tells you soon enough. People imagine harmful people as obvious. They imagine arrogance so loud it announces itself at the door. They imagine manipulation with a villain's face, deception with a sneer, control with a raised voice. But that is not how it often begins. In the beginning, what makes a narcissist appear untouchable is the opposite of obviousness. It is polish. It is timing. It is presentation. It is the strange and unsettling ability to make distortion look like confidence, and self-absorption look like strength. That was what Sophia could not understand at first. Chicago kept moving around her the way cities do, trains cutting through the afternoon, coffee shops full of people on laptops, polished buildings reflecting cold light back into the streets, but inside her, something had already begun to fracture. Not because she had been blindsided by something crude, but because the man who was undoing her looked so composed while doing it. He knew how to enter a room without seeming needy. He knew how to speak with just enough certainty that people mistook his confidence for wisdom. He knew how to listen in a way that felt intentional, even when he was only collecting information. He knew how to become memorable without appearing to try. And that is why narcissists often seem untouchable at first. They understand the power of image long before most people understand the cost of illusion. They know that in a world drawn to charm, the person who appears calm is often assumed to be right. The one who speaks smoothly is assumed to be truthful. The one who keeps a straight face while someone else is unraveling is assumed to be stable. It is a performance, yes, but it is a sophisticated one. And because it is sophisticated, it gets rewarded. In the early stages, a narcissist often looks like the answer to the chaos you have known before. They seem clear where others were messy. Focused where others were scattered. Strong where others were uncertain. Even their intensity can feel attractive because it arrives dressed as conviction. They can make you feel chosen, noticed, elevated. They have a gift for making attention feel like intimacy. For a while, this is intoxicating. Not because you are naive, but because human beings are wired to move toward warmth, certainty, and recognition. That is what makes the trap so disorienting later. Sophia did not fall for cruelty. She fell for coherence. Or what looked like coherence. She fell for the way he could speak about life as if he understood it deeply. She fell for the way he made ordinary evenings feel charged with meaning. She fell for the sense that he had a center of gravity, that he was not easily shaken, that he knew who he was. To someone standing outside the relationship, those qualities would still have looked admirable. That is part of the problem. Narcissistic control often hides beneath traits the culture celebrates: ambition, charisma, social fluency, confidence, decisiveness. But what the outside world calls confidence is not always inner security. Sometimes it is just a highly trained refusal to be questioned. That distinction matters more than most people realize. A truly grounded person does not need constant control over the emotional climate of every interaction. A truly secure person does not need admiration to regulate their sense of self. A truly honest person does not need every misunderstanding to end in their innocence. But a narcissist does. That is why the image must be protected at all costs. Not because it is beautiful, but because it is necessary. The performance is not decoration. It is life support. And this is where the illusion becomes so difficult to expose. From the outside, people see the polished version. They see the man who is articulate at dinner, impressive at work, magnetic with strangers, composed under pressure. They see someone who seems socially intelligent, maybe even generous. They do not see what happens in the private spaces where no audience is present. They do not see the subtle corrections, the strategic silences, the emotional reversals, the quiet punishments, the way one conversation can leave another person feeling guilty for having basic needs. They do not see how tenderness gets used as access. They do not see how attention becomes surveillance, how reassurance becomes control, how love becomes a stage on which only one person is allowed to remain innocent. That is why survivors often feel crazy when they try to explain what happened. The evidence does not always look dramatic enough when laid out in plain language. He changed the subject. He denied what he said. He acted hurt when I brought up my pain. He made me feel selfish for asking simple questions. Each moment sounds small when isolated. But small moments, repeated under the right psychological pressure, can dismantle a person's confidence with astonishing efficiency. This is another reason narcissists seem untouchable at first. They rarely destroy all at once. They erode. They do not need to overpower your entire reality in one move. They only need to make you uncertain in enough moments that you begin handing over your authority voluntarily. Not because you want to, but because confusion is exhausting, and the human mind longs for relief. If the person causing the confusion also presents themselves as the one most qualified to interpret it, the trap deepens. That is how control becomes invisible. You do not feel conquered. You feel gradually disoriented. And while all of this is happening, the narcissist often continues to thrive socially. In fact, early success is part of what strengthens the illusion. People respond to polish. Workplaces reward confidence. Social circles admire charm. A person who knows how to perform certainty can move very far in environments that rarely stop to ask what that certainty is built on. The world is often far more responsive to appearance than to substance, especially at first glance. So the narcissist learns an important lesson very early: if the outside looks strong enough, many people will never examine the inside. That is why they can appear so untouchable. Not because they are beyond consequence. Not because they are truly powerful. But because they have built a version of themselves that photographs well in public and deflects scrutiny in private. Sophia slowly began to understand that what had looked like emotional strength was often emotional absence. What had looked like certainty was often rigidity. What had looked like self-possession was often a desperate need to control the narrative before anyone else could name what was happening. That realization did not come quickly. It almost never does. It came in fragments. A look that felt colder than it should have. An apology that never led to change. A conversation that ended with her feeling smaller instead of clearer. A pattern too precise to keep calling accidental. And that is the turning point for many people, the moment they realize the narcissist was never untouchable because they were solid. They only seemed untouchable because they were protected by surface. Surface is powerful in the beginning. But surface has limits. A polished mask can impress strangers, influence rooms, and delay exposure for longer than seems fair. It can even make the wounded person doubt their own story for a painful stretch of time. But a life built on performance always carries strain inside it. What appears effortless is often being maintained at enormous internal cost. The image may look seamless from across the room, but underneath it is constant vigilance, constant management, constant hunger for reinforcement. That is not peace. That is not wholeness. That is not strength. It is maintenance disguised as mastery. And one of the most important moments in healing is when you stop envying the very image that helped wound you. When you finally see that the untouchable aura was never proof of health. It was proof of construction. It was something engineered, defended, curated, and fed. It looked powerful because it was designed to. But what is designed to dominate is not the same as what is rooted deeply enough to endure. That distinction changes everything. Because once you begin to see how carefully the illusion is maintained, you stop mistaking appearance for immunity. And that is when the first layer of their power begins to break. What they really did when they hurt you. What they did to you was not merely unkind. It was not simply dishonest. It was not just a series of difficult moments that hurt more than they should have. What they did went deeper than behavior. It entered the invisible places where trust, identity, and emotional safety are formed, and it disrupted them from the inside. That is why the damage has been so hard to explain. Sophia kept trying, especially in the quieter weeks after the worst of it had passed. She would sit in her Chicago apartment, replaying conversations in her mind, looking for the exact sentence that had done the damage. She wanted a clean answer, a moment she could circle in red and say, "There." That was it. That was when everything changed. But the truth was more unsettling than that. It was not one sentence. It was a pattern. Not one betrayal, but a slow invasion. Not one lie, but an atmosphere in which reality itself became unstable. That is what they really did when they hurt you. They did not just wound your emotions. They interfered with your relationship to truth. A normal injury, painful as it may be, still leaves your inner compass intact. You know what happened. You know how it felt. You know where the violation was. But narcissistic harm operates differently. It does not simply leave pain behind. It leaves confusion in pain's place. It makes you carry the wound and then question whether the wound is real. It forces you to bleed inward while asking yourself whether you are imagining the knife. That is why this kind of harm feels so much heavier than ordinary heartbreak. Because they did not only break your trust. They tampered with the very system by which trust is recognized. Sophia was not destroyed by obvious malice. She was undone by contradiction. A cold remark followed by tenderness. A lie followed by wounded innocence. Dismissal followed by charm. Distance followed by sudden intensity. Every time she tried to make sense of the whole picture, he made her focus on one isolated piece. One sweet message. One calm explanation. One affectionate gesture. One apology that sounded just sincere enough to keep hope alive. And that is how the distortion works. It does not erase all evidence. It scatters it, rearranges it, mixes warmth with injury until your mind becomes exhausted trying to assemble a truth that keeps getting moved. That exhaustion is not accidental. It is part of the harm. Because when a person is kept in a state of emotional contradiction long enough, they become easier to manage. They stop standing firmly in what they know. They begin negotiating with what should never have been negotiable. They start asking less of reality because asking clearly has become too costly. The mind adapts to survive. The heart lowers its expectations just to keep from breaking every day. And that is one of the cruelest things a narcissist does. They do not only hurt you in the moment. They train you to abandon yourself in advance. You become quieter before conflict even begins. You edit your language before speaking. You soften truths that deserve to be spoken plainly. You monitor their mood before expressing a need. You offer empathy before receiving accountability. You prepare to lose before the conversation has even started. After a while, this no longer feels like adaptation. It feels like personality. You begin to think this shrinking is who you are. But it is not who you are. It is what happened to you. And the tragedy is that the qualities most deeply damaged are often the ones you were most proud of before. Your patience. Your ability to understand complexity. Your desire to see the good in people. Your willingness to stay when things got hard. Your instinct to forgive. Your hope. Your tenderness. Your loyalty. These were not weaknesses. They were beautiful human capacities. They were evidence of depth, not deficiency. But in the hands of a narcissist, those gifts become openings. Your loyalty becomes permission for repeated injury. Your empathy becomes access to your boundaries. Your patience becomes room for their distortion. Your hope becomes a hiding place for their pattern. This is why the betrayal feels sacred in its depth. Because what they used against you was not your worst side. It was your best. They weaponized your goodness. And once that happens, the aftermath becomes more than grief. It becomes a crisis of self-trust. You do not only mourn the relationship. You begin to mourn the version of yourself that once moved through the world with innocence. You miss the way things used to feel before every emotionally charged interaction became something to analyze. You miss the simplicity of believing your own instincts without needing external confirmation. You miss how easy it once was to be sincere. That loss matters. It matters deeply. Because what they really stole was not only peace. It was ease. It was the unforced confidence of a person who still believed that honesty would be met with honesty, that concern would be met with care, that pain voiced clearly would not be used as evidence against them later. And then there is the humiliation that often hides beneath the grief. Not humiliation because you were foolish, but humiliation because somewhere inside, you realize how many times your sincerity was studied instead of cherished. How many times your words were listened to not for understanding, but for leverage. How many times your vulnerability became material that could later be turned, twisted, or withheld. There is a particular kind of sorrow in realizing that while you were trying to build connection, the other person was often trying to build advantage. That is not mere relational failure. That is moral injury. Because healthy love meets vulnerability with reverence. Healthy care meets truth with respect. Healthy relationships do not feed on confusion. They do not require you to betray your own nervous system in order to keep them alive. They do not ask you to call chaos chemistry, or manipulation depth, or emotional instability passion. They do not make you more estranged from your own soul. But narcissistic harm does exactly that. It pulls you away from yourself and then leaves you to believe you wandered there alone. Sophia did not just lose time. She lost internal ground. She lost the stable feeling of standing on something emotionally solid. Even after the worst moments were over, she could feel how deeply the pattern had entered her. Sometimes she would catch herself explaining simple choices to an empty room, as if still preparing for cross-examination. Sometimes she would hesitate before trusting an obvious feeling. Sometimes she would feel guilty for resting, guilty for pulling away, guilty for recovering. That is how deep the injury had gone. It was no longer just in the relationship. It had taken residence in her inner life. That is why naming what they really did matters so much. Because healing begins when the fog is given accurate language. They did not just disappoint you. They destabilized you. They did not just make mistakes. They manipulated the emotional atmosphere until you no longer knew where safety ended and performance began. They did not just fail to love you well. They used the mechanics of intimacy against you. And once you see that clearly, something begins to shift. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But truth starts returning to its rightful place. You stop treating the damage as if it were too mysterious to name. You stop reducing a profound violation to ordinary conflict. You stop telling yourself that maybe it was all just miscommunication. No. What they did was more deliberate than confusion wants to admit and more destructive than politeness knows how to describe. They interfered with your reality, fed on your trust, and made your goodness carry the cost of their emptiness. And that is why the wound went so deep. The invisible law narcissists cannot escape. There is a law woven into reality that narcissists spend their lives trying to outrun, but they never do. They may delay it. They may disguise the evidence for a season. They may even persuade other people that nothing is wrong. But they cannot escape it, because it does not depend on public opinion, timing, or appearances. It is older than image. It is deeper than reputation. It is the invisible law that every life built on distortion eventually begins to collapse under the weight of what it really is. This is one of the hardest truths for someone like Sophia to trust in the beginning. Chicago still looked the same from her apartment window. The trains still moved with their old certainty. The streets still carried strangers into coffee shops, office towers, bars, and late dinners as if the world had not changed. But inside her, the sense of order had been disturbed. The great offense of narcissistic harm is not only that it wounds you. It is that it makes the universe look morally confusing for a while. It makes you wonder how deception can be so effective. How manipulation can look like success. How someone who bends truth, exploits tenderness, and drains the life out of another human being can still appear to move through life untouched. That question does not come from bitterness alone. It comes from a very deep human need to believe that reality still means something. Because if a person can build themselves through falsehood, if they can injure others and still keep their charm, still keep their influence, still keep their audience, then what does that say about the structure of the world itself? What does it say about truth? What does it say about justice? What does it say about all the quiet people who stayed honest and suffered for it? This is where many wounded people become spiritually exhausted. Not only from pain, but from the apparent triumph of unreality. And yet that triumph is never as solid as it seems. A narcissist lives as though truth were optional. That is one of their great illusions. They behave as though reality is something that can be negotiated indefinitely, as though consequences are only for those careless enough to get caught, as though what matters most is not what is real but what can be maintained. But reality does not work like that. Reality can be distorted in experience for a time, but not erased in structure. That difference is everything. There are laws in life that do not ask for belief before they operate. Gravity is one of them. You do not need to respect it for it to affect you. You do not need to understand it for it to take hold. You discover it most clearly when you try to defy it. In the same way, there is a moral architecture to existence that does not disappear because someone is charismatic enough to mock it. Truth carries weight whether a person honors it or not. Character has consequences whether a person admits them or not. Falsehood accumulates strain whether a person feels invincible or not. That is the invisible law narcissists cannot escape. What is built against truth eventually begins to break under its own design. Not because the sky opens. Not because some dramatic external punishment always arrives on schedule. But because every lie creates maintenance. Every distortion creates tension. Every manipulative performance creates a widening gap between the false self being projected and the actual inner life struggling to sustain it. That gap is not harmless. It is expensive. It demands constant energy, constant vigilance, constant reinforcement. What looks effortless from the outside is often being held together by relentless internal labor. Sophia had not understood that at first. She had looked at the composure, the image, the social fluency, and assumed there must be something strong beneath it. That is what most people assume when they see a person who appears controlled. But control is not the same as order. Presentation is not the same as peace. A person can look highly organized while their soul is arranged around avoidance. They can sound certain while living in profound inner fragmentation. They can appear powerful while borrowing stability from the attention, confusion, and emotional labor of others. This is why narcissists often seem to flourish in the short term. They know how to extract reinforcement from the world around them. They know how to convert charm into access, certainty into influence, performance into protection. For a while, that can resemble strength. But it is not strength in the deepest sense. It is dependency wearing polished clothes. A truly grounded life can survive reality because it is rooted in reality. It can withstand correction because correction does not threaten its existence. It can endure exposure because there is less to expose. But a narcissistic life is organized around image management, narrative control, and the avoidance of genuine self-confrontation. That makes it far more fragile than it appears. The whole structure depends on preventing too much truth from entering at once. And the problem with building your life that way is that truth does not stop existing simply because it is unwelcome. It waits. It gathers. It presses quietly from beneath the surface. This is what makes the law invisible for so long. It does not always announce itself in ways that satisfy the wounded person's desire for immediate justice. It often works beneath the visible storyline long before there is public evidence. The collapse begins in hidden places. In the increasing effort it takes to maintain the mask. In the relationships that grow thinner even if they have not yet ended. In the inability to rest without distraction. In the subtle decay of trust. In the growing need for more admiration to achieve the same emotional effect. In the fear that one contradiction, one witness, one moment of weakness, one unanswered message, one independent mind, could expose more than the entire performance can tolerate. That is not freedom. That is not victory. That is the early architecture of consequence. What makes this law so profound is that it does not merely punish acts. It reveals structures. It uncovers what a person has truly built their identity upon. If that identity is rooted in truth, humility, accountability, and the willingness to be corrected, then time deepens it. But if that identity is rooted in illusion, entitlement, exploitation, and the manipulation of perception, then time does the opposite. Time does not strengthen it. Time exposes the cracks that were always there. And cracks matter. A glittering building can still be standing while its foundation is quietly shifting underneath it. To a passerby, nothing looks wrong. The exterior remains impressive. The lines are clean. The image holds. But beneath the surface, pressure is accumulating. Support is weakening. The structure is already in dialogue with collapse long before collapse becomes visible. That is how many narcissistic lives operate. They are often standing inside consequences they do not yet recognize. Sophia needed this truth because pain had made her impatient, and understandably so. She wanted moral clarity to show up in a form the eye could immediately understand. She wanted outcomes that looked proportionate. She wanted distortion to be publicly named and truth to be publicly vindicated. But the invisible law does not always move theatrically. It moves precisely. It works at the level of design. It lets a person become more fully what they have chosen, and that is often where the deepest judgment begins. Because eventually a human being cannot live too long against reality without reality answering back. Not always through scandal. Not always through sudden ruin. Sometimes through a gradual hardening of the soul. Sometimes through inner emptiness no success can fill. Sometimes through relationships losing depth until all that remains are transactions, audiences, and mirrors. Sometimes through a life that still looks impressive from the outside but has become spiritually uninhabitable from within. This is why the narcissist's apparent invulnerability is never the final story. They are not exempt from the order of things. They are not outside consequence. They are not somehow special enough to bypass the conditions of being human. They may have learned how to manipulate perceptions, but they have not learned how to suspend truth itself. No one does. And once you begin to understand that, something steadies in you. You stop measuring justice only by what is immediately visible. You stop assuming that delay means absence. You stop mistaking appearance for immunity. You begin to see that reality is not morally empty just because it is patient. In fact, its patience is part of its seriousness. The invisible law does not rush because it does not need to. It knows exactly where everything built on falsehood eventually goes. How God's revenge actually begins. What God's revenge actually begins with is not thunder. It is not spectacle. It is not the sudden destruction people imagine when they are hurting badly enough to want immediate proof that heaven saw what happened. It does not usually begin with public humiliation, dramatic exposure, or some instant collapse so obvious that everyone around you finally understands your pain. That is human revenge. It is loud, urgent, emotional, and visible. But divine revenge moves differently. It begins in places so quiet most people miss it entirely. It begins the moment truth is no longer being resisted without cost. That is the part Sophia could not see at first. From the window of her apartment in Chicago, life still looked insultingly normal. The trains ran on time. People spilled out of office buildings with coffee in hand, talking into phones, laughing at things that had nothing to do with her suffering. The city moved with that cold efficiency cities have, as if nothing sacred had just been violated in her life. And somewhere inside that same city, the man who had confused her, diminished her, and fed on her trust was still walking around with his image intact. Still speaking smoothly. Still gathering approval. Still untouched, it seemed, by the wreckage he had left behind. That apparent untouched quality is what wounds people a second time. It is not only that the narcissist hurt you. It is that they often seem to continue forward while you are left carrying the weight of what they broke. You are the one losing sleep. You are the one replaying conversations. You are the one trying to rebuild your confidence in your own perception. Meanwhile, they look composed. They look social. They look successful. And the human heart, especially the wounded heart, cries out with a painful question, where is justice in that? But divine revenge does not begin where appearances end. It begins where reality starts pressing back. And reality always presses back. The first form of God's revenge is exposure, though not always public exposure. People often think exposure means scandal, confession, disgrace, or being found out in front of everyone. Sometimes that happens. But often the deeper exposure comes first, and it happens beneath the surface. It begins when the narcissist's false self can no longer move through the world without friction. It begins when the lies that once seemed effortless now require more maintenance. More energy. More management. More manipulation. More surveillance of how they are perceived. More control over who knows what, who believes what, who might leave, who might speak, who might stop cooperating with the illusion. This is not peace. This is not power. This is the beginning of consequence. Because once a person has built identity on distortion, life becomes a full-time effort to prevent reality from entering too deeply. They are not living freely. They are living defensively. Every relationship becomes a mirror to manage. Every disagreement becomes a threat to neutralize. Every independent mind becomes a possible witness. Every silence feels dangerous. Every loss of control feels like annihilation. That is how divine revenge begins. Not by God becoming chaotic, but by God allowing a person to fully inhabit the unstable structure they themselves created. This is where many people misunderstand justice. They think justice means interruption from the outside. But often the most devastating judgment is permission from the inside. Permission for the narcissist to continue becoming exactly what their choices are shaping them into. Permission for the mask to grow heavier. Permission for emptiness to deepen. Permission for the gap between performance and reality to widen until it becomes exhausting to carry. Sophia could not see any of that in the beginning because pain narrows vision. When someone has violated your trust, your heart wants symmetry. You want to see them feel what you felt. You want immediate moral clarity. You want heaven to answer in a language visible enough to calm your nervous system. But heaven is not insecure. It does not need to perform justice for your comfort in order for justice to be real. It works with a precision far more unsettling than spectacle. It lets character ripen into consequence. And that is what makes divine revenge so exact. A narcissist often believes they are escaping because they mistake delay for absence. They think that because the world still applauds, because their face still works in public, because new people still fall for the charm, because no lightning has struck, they are safe. But they are confusing applause with blessing, movement with peace, and control with stability. These are not the same things. The second thing God's revenge begins with is erosion. Not the erosion of reputation first, though that may come later. The erosion of internal coherence. The erosion of rest. The erosion of genuine connection. The erosion of the ability to trust love that is not based on performance. The erosion of emotional safety within their own mind. A narcissist can collect attention and still be starving. They can gather admiration and still feel hunted by irrelevance. They can win socially and lose spiritually at the same time. This is why so many outwardly successful narcissists are inwardly tormented in ways few people understand. Their suffering is not always visible because it is not always theatrical. But it is real. Anxiety. Restlessness. Irritability. Rage at small things. Suspicion. Emptiness that no amount of validation can settle. A chronic inability to receive love as love, because love to them has become entangled with control, superiority, and emotional leverage. They do not know how to rest in something real because they have organized themselves around maintaining something false. That is not a side effect. That is a sentence. And then there is the third movement of divine revenge, separation. Not always in the obvious form of people dramatically walking away, though that can happen. More often it begins in quieter ways. Depth leaves the room. Trust thins out. Warmth becomes harder to sustain. Conversations lose sincerity. The people around them may still remain physically present for a while, but something essential starts withdrawing. A person can be surrounded and still become relationally abandoned. This is one of the most painful judgments a narcissist can face, because they depend so completely on external reflection to feel real. When that reflection grows flatter, weaker, less devoted, less enchanted, panic begins rising inside them. Sophia once thought divine revenge would look like an event. A downfall. A moment. But the truth is more profound than that. It begins as a process. A kind of moral unraveling built into the architecture of deception itself. God does not need to invent a punishment foreign to the narcissist's life. The punishment is already latent in the falsehood. It is already growing inside the choices. It is already present in the widening distance between who they pretend to be and what they are becoming. That is why divine revenge feels so different from human retaliation. Human retaliation tries to inflict pain. Divine revenge reveals reality. Human retaliation is driven by the wound. Divine revenge is driven by truth. Human retaliation asks, how can I make them suffer? Divine revenge asks, what happens when a person keeps violating reality, love, and conscience until the consequences are no longer containable? The answer is collapse, but not all at once. First comes the strain. Then the erosion. Then the exposure. Then the life they built begins turning against them from within. That is why the beginning of God's revenge is so easy to miss if you are only looking for public drama. It starts in hidden places. In the soul. In the nervous system. In the increasingly unbearable effort of keeping the mask alive. In the loneliness of never being truly known. In the terror of losing control over even one part of the narrative. In the quiet awareness, however deeply buried, that none of what surrounds them can give them what truth could have given them freely, peace. And that is the most sobering part of all. God's revenge does not begin when your pain ends. It begins the moment their false world starts costing more than they can bear. The personal hell narcissists build for themselves. The most frightening part of a narcissist's downfall is that it often does not look like punishment from the outside. It looks like normal life. It looks like motion. It looks like routine. It looks like someone still getting dressed in the morning, still answering texts, still showing up in rooms, still speaking with confidence, still wearing the face that once convinced everyone they were untouchable. That is why so many wounded people misread what is happening. They assume that because the narcissist is still functioning, still visible, still admired in certain spaces, they must still be winning. But there is a form of ruin that happens long before the world has language for it. There is a private hell that narcissists build for themselves, and the tragedy is that they build it brick by brick with the very traits they once believed would protect them. Sophia did not understand this when she first began trying to piece her life back together in Chicago. In those early days, she still thought suffering had to look dramatic in order to count. She still imagined consequence as something obvious. She thought that if justice were real, it would arrive like a visible collapse, some public event no one could ignore. What she had not yet grasped was that for a narcissist, the deepest punishment is often not exposure first. It is habitation. It is being forced to live inside the self they spent years constructing. And that self is not a home. It is a prison. A narcissist spends so much energy building an outer image that they never develop a safe inner life. That is the first truth people miss. Most healthy people, even wounded healthy people, still possess some inward place where they can tell the truth to themselves. They may hurt. They may grieve. They may wrestle with shame or regret. But somewhere inside there remains the possibility of honesty, and honesty is the beginning of peace. A narcissist does not live there. They cannot rest in self-confrontation because self-confrontation threatens the entire structure of who they believe they must be. So they avoid. They deflect. They project. They blame. They perform. And for a while, these strategies can create the illusion of strength. But over time, every avoided truth remains inside the system. It does not disappear. It accumulates pressure. It settles into the nervous system. It distorts relationships. It turns ordinary vulnerability into danger. It makes real intimacy feel invasive because intimacy requires being known, and being known is precisely what the narcissist has spent years trying to prevent. That is where the personal hell begins. Imagine moving through life unable to rest because rest would mean dropping the performance. Imagine needing admiration not because it feels nice, but because without it your sense of self begins to flicker. Imagine being praised and still feeling empty, being surrounded and still feeling threatened, being noticed and still feeling unseen in the deepest possible way. That is the contradiction narcissists carry. They may receive attention, but attention is not the same as love. They may receive applause, but applause cannot calm a soul estranged from truth. They may receive compliance, desire, envy, even fear, but none of those things can create peace. Peace only comes where reality is no longer being resisted. And they are built around resistance. This is why so many narcissists live with an undercurrent of agitation that never fully leaves them. They may not describe it that way. They may call it boredom, frustration, disappointment, other people being impossible, life being unfair, the world not recognizing their worth enough. But underneath all those explanations is something more primitive and more painful. They are chronically at war with anything that threatens the false self. A small criticism can feel catastrophic. A boundary can feel like betrayal. Someone else's happiness can feel like a personal insult. Another person's calm indifference can feel unbearable. Why? Because the narcissist is not reacting only to the event in front of them. They are reacting from the instability of a self that cannot survive ordinary reality without decoration. That kind of existence is exhausting. Not dramatic all the time, but exhausting in the way that slowly hollows a person out. They become suspicious, not because everyone is against them, but because they themselves know how much deception holds their world together. They become reactive, not because life is uniquely cruel to them, but because their internal structure has no room for humility. They become restless, not because they are driven in some noble sense, but because stillness increases the chances of contact with what they have been avoiding. Sophia began to see this more clearly when she stopped measuring health by appearances. She had once looked at composure and mistaken it for peace. She had looked at confidence and mistaken it for solidity. She had looked at his ability to move smoothly through public spaces and assumed that meant he carried no real consequences inside him. But what she gradually came to understand is that a person can function socially and still be spiritually disintegrating. They can keep conversations going, keep their wardrobe sharp, keep their status intact, and still be living in a form of inner starvation. Because when a person abandons truth long enough, they lose access to simple human experiences that make life feel meaningful. They cannot trust affection without suspecting a motive. They cannot receive correction without feeling humiliation. They cannot be loved deeply because being loved deeply requires being seen truthfully. They cannot relax into closeness because closeness always threatens exposure. They cannot enjoy success cleanly because success only feeds the image, never the void beneath it. This is the torment. Not that they have nothing, but that nothing they gather can reach the place that needs healing. That is a kind of hell many survivors do not think about at first because their own pain is so immediate. Understandably, they focus on what was taken from them. Their sleep. Their clarity. Their stability. Their self-trust. But over time, a sobering recognition begins to emerge: the narcissist is not living in freedom either. They are living in captivity to appetite, image, and control. They need too much from the world because they possess too little peace within themselves. They are constantly reaching, constantly regulating, constantly managing. Every interaction carries the hidden question: does this feed me, threaten me, expose me, or diminish me? That is not love. That is not life in abundance. That is survival inside a false identity. And false identities are costly places to live. The most chilling part is that narcissists often keep intensifying the very behaviors that are destroying them. Instead of softening, they harden. Instead of reflecting, they externalize blame. Instead of grieving what they have lost, they seek new sources of supply. Instead of allowing pain to humble them, they turn pain into more entitlement. This is why their world often becomes smaller over time, even if it looks full. The range of people who can truly know them narrows. The capacity for authentic connection weakens. The need for performance grows. And eventually, life becomes a hall of mirrors where everything reflects something back, but nothing nourishes. Even admiration begins to fail them. That may be the saddest truth of all. A healthy person can receive love and be warmed by it because there is a self inside capable of meeting it honestly. A narcissist often receives praise the way a fire receives paper. It flares, consumes, and then wants more. Nothing settles. Nothing satisfies. Nothing becomes enough for long. They are hungry in public and haunted in private. And because they have built their lives around avoiding vulnerability, they have very few ways out of that hunger except deeper performance. That is the personal hell they build for themselves. Not simply the loss of other people, though that matters. Not simply eventual exposure, though that may come. But the unbearable reality of having become a person who cannot experience truth without threat, love without suspicion, or success without emptiness. Sophia did not need to celebrate this to understand it. In fact, understanding it made her quieter. More sober. More clear. It helped her stop envying what had once intimidated her. It helped her stop mistaking surface power for inner wholeness. And most importantly, it helped her see that the narcissist's punishment is often not that life suddenly destroys them from the outside. It is that they must wake up every day inside the world their own falsehood has made. Why you must not become what hurt you. One of the deepest dangers of being wounded by a narcissist is not only the pain they cause. It is the temptation they awaken in you afterward. Not the temptation to cry. Not the temptation to withdraw. Those are human responses to injury. The real danger is subtler and far more serious. It is the temptation to become shaped by the very thing that harmed you. To let betrayal teach you that love is foolish. To let manipulation teach you that honesty is weakness. To let cruelty teach you that softness is unsafe. To let injustice teach you that the only way to survive is to grow cold, strategic, unreachable, and hard. That is the moment the real battle begins. Sophia felt it in Chicago long before she had language for it. Not in one dramatic flash, but in a series of small inner shifts that frightened her more than she wanted to admit. She noticed how quickly suspicion now rose in her when someone was kind. She noticed how often she imagined hidden motives behind ordinary gestures. She noticed the strange pleasure that came from fantasizing about indifference, as if never needing anyone again could somehow heal what had been done to her. There were evenings when she would sit by the window, watching the city move below her in its cold, glittering rhythm, and feel a version of herself forming that she did not entirely recognize. Sharper. Less trusting. Less warm. More protected, perhaps. But also less alive. That is how the wound tries to reproduce itself. Pain that is not understood does not simply disappear. It looks for somewhere to go. And if a person is not careful, it begins hardening around the soul. At first this can feel like strength. Refusing vulnerability feels strong when vulnerability was exploited. Detachment feels wise when closeness became a doorway for control. Silence feels powerful when your words were twisted. But there is a difference between wise restraint and spiritual shutdown. There is a difference between discernment and bitterness. There is a difference between boundaries and emotional death. That distinction matters because narcissistic harm does not only want to dominate your past. It wants to alter your future. It wants the injury to keep spreading long after the relationship has changed form or ended. It wants to remain alive inside your reactions, your assumptions, your fears, your tone, your capacity to trust, your willingness to hope. In other words, it is not enough for that kind of darkness to hurt you once. It seeks to teach you its language. And that is why you must not become what hurt you. Not because you owe anyone softness at the expense of wisdom. Not because you should remain naive. Not because healing means pretending nothing happened. But because the moment you surrender your core values in response to their distortion, the damage deepens. The narcissist may no longer control the relationship, but they still control the shape of your becoming. They still get the final say in who you are turning into. And that is too high a price. Sophia began to understand this when she noticed how often revenge had become a private form of emotional fuel. She did not always imagine dramatic revenge. Sometimes it was quieter than that. She wanted the satisfaction of being misunderstood by no one ever again. She wanted the cold dignity of no longer caring. She wanted to become so self-contained, so unreadable, so emotionally unreachable that no one could ever enter deeply enough to wound her again. On the surface, this seemed like healing. But underneath, something in her knew it was not. It was fear trying to dress itself as wisdom. Because healing does not mean becoming less human. It means becoming more anchored in what is true. That is the hard path. The narrow path. The one very few people celebrate in the moment because it does not sparkle. It does not offer the instant satisfaction of retaliation. It does not hand you the quick emotional reward of saying the cutting thing, exposing the humiliating truth, or watching someone squirm under the weight of what they deserve. Instead, it asks something more difficult of you. It asks you to remain in contact with your own conscience even while your pain is begging for a weapon. It asks you to protect your soul from adopting the methods of the one who injured it. This is not passivity. It is discipline at the deepest level. Human beings often mistake aggression for strength because aggression produces a visible effect. It looks decisive. It moves energy quickly. It makes pain feel active instead of helpless. But not every active response is powerful. Some are merely reactive. They feel strong because they are intense, but intensity is not the same as authority. Sometimes real authority is quiet. Sometimes it is choosing not to explain yourself one more time to someone committed to misunderstanding you. Sometimes it is letting a false story circulate without rushing to collapse yourself trying to control every perception. Sometimes it is stepping back, documenting what is real, speaking where necessary, and then refusing to live your one precious life inside a courtroom that exists only in another person's ego. Sophia had to learn this slowly. There were mornings she wanted to send the message. To correct the record. To state the facts one more time with flawless precision. To finally say the thing that would make the whole pattern undeniable. But over time she came to see that some people do not misunderstand because the evidence is weak. They misunderstand because misunderstanding is useful to them. And once you see that, something changes. You stop performing your truth for those who have already chosen distortion. You stop chasing vindication as though it were the same thing as freedom. That shift is sacred. Because the real battle after narcissistic harm is not always about what happened between two people. It is about whether your character can survive the wound without becoming rearranged around it. Can you remain honest without becoming defenseless? Can you become discerning without becoming cynical? Can you set boundaries without losing tenderness? Can you walk away without needing to poison your own spirit to do it? Those are not small questions. They determine the kind of person suffering will produce in you. This is why your practices matter after betrayal. Not just your conclusions, but your habits. The private rituals by which you either return to yourself or keep feeding the injury. Sophia began learning this not through grand revelations, but through ordinary acts of recovery. She started taking long walks along the lake instead of rereading old messages late into the night. She wrote in a journal what she wished she could say, not because the page would solve everything, but because truth needed somewhere clean to land. She returned to therapy not to rehearse the old chaos endlessly, but to understand what in her had mistaken emotional confusion for love. She began strength training on quiet weekday mornings, not to outrun pain, but to remember that her body was still hers. She called old friends back. She cooked again. She turned off social media for stretches long enough to hear her own mind without interruption. Some Sundays she sat in church without answers, just grateful to be somewhere that did not require performance. These things may sound small to the outside world. But this is how a soul refuses corruption. Not through one dramatic decision, but through repeated choices that say, I will not let injury become identity. I will not let bitterness become wisdom. I will not let someone else's emptiness teach me to abandon what is most alive in me. Because that is what narcissistic harm tries to do. It does not only want to make you sad. It wants to make you false. It wants to convince you that the only safe way to live is to manipulate before being manipulated, detach before being known, perform before being rejected, dominate before being diminished. It wants to convert pain into philosophy. It wants your wound to become your worldview. You must not let it. The irony is that becoming like the narcissist would feel, for a moment, like relief. The relief of no longer being the one who cares more. The relief of no longer being vulnerable to disappointment. The relief of no longer giving people the benefit of the doubt. But that relief is counterfeit. It costs too much. It cuts you off not only from danger, but from joy, intimacy, spontaneity, reverence, trust, and the ability to love without calculation. It promises protection and delivers isolation. It promises power and delivers emptiness. It promises freedom and delivers a smaller soul. Sophia's deepest healing did not begin when she stopped hurting. It began when she realized she still had a choice about what pain would make of her. She could let it harden her into someone unrecognizable, or she could let it clarify her into someone wiser. She could close forever, or she could become more careful without becoming less real. She could confuse numbness with strength, or she could learn the far more difficult art of staying open only where truth was welcome. That is why you must not become what hurt you. Because your greatest victory is not that they finally understand your pain. It is that they do not get to define your character. It is that after all the distortion, you still tell the truth. After all the manipulation, you still choose integrity. After all the betrayal, you still refuse to feed yourself on control. After all the confusion, you still belong to your own conscience. That is not weakness. That is the beginning of moral freedom. And in the end, that kind of freedom will take you somewhere the narcissist can never follow. What God restores in the person who chooses truth. What God restores in the person who chooses truth is not merely comfort. It is not a shallow kind of relief, not a quick emotional rebound, not a polished version of the same wounded self trying to look strong again. What God restores is deeper than mood. Deeper than reputation. Deeper even than the visible pieces of life that may have been shattered. He begins restoring the inner order that narcissistic harm tried to destroy. That is why real healing feels so different from performance. Performance says, I'm over it. Restoration says, I am becoming whole again. Those are not the same thing. Sophia began to understand this slowly, almost reluctantly, in Chicago. Not in a single breakthrough, not in one dramatic morning when all confusion vanished at once, but through a series of quiet returns. The city was still the same city. The train still rattled past. The lake still held that cold, open stillness that made her feel both small and strangely comforted. The streets still carried people into meetings, apartment buildings, cafes, and grocery stores with the ordinary urgency of life continuing. But something in her was changing, and for the first time, that change was not being shaped by fear. It was being shaped by truth. That is where restoration begins. Not when the narcissist apologizes. Not when the story is corrected publicly. Not when everyone finally sees what you saw. Those things may never come in the way you once hoped. Restoration begins and you stop organizing your inner life around distortion. It begins when you stop asking lies to produce peace. It begins when you stop making confusion your compass and start honoring what your soul has known for a long time. At first, this can feel almost anticlimactic. The wounded heart expects healing to announce itself. It expects a dramatic shift, a clean emotional ending, some moment so powerful that it cancels the grief. But God often restores in quieter ways. He restores by rebuilding the parts of you that deception weakened. He restores by giving back what manipulation taught you to mistrust. He restores by returning you to yourself, not to the self that existed before pain, but to a deeper self refined by it. Sophia noticed one of the first restorations in the simplest possible way. Her thoughts began to sound less hostile toward her own heart. That mattered more than she realized. For so long, the damage had not only lived in memory. It had lived in interpretation. Every feeling had to pass through suspicion. Every instinct had to defend itself. Every boundary felt like something she needed to justify. Every emotion was interrogated before it was honored. That is what narcissistic harm does. It makes a person foreign to their own inner voice. But when truth begins restoring you, one of the first gifts is self-trust. Not arrogance. Not impulsiveness. Something steadier than that. A quiet return to the ability to say, what I felt was real. What I saw mattered. What my soul resisted was not madness. It was wisdom trying to survive. That kind of restoration is holy because it gives a person back their center. And once that center starts returning, other things follow. Discernment returns. This is different from suspicion. Suspicion is fear wearing sharp eyes. Discernment is peace learning how to see clearly. Sophia began noticing that she no longer needed chaos in order to feel intensity, and she no longer confused emotional volatility with depth. She started recognizing the difference between someone being charming and someone being safe. She became more attentive to small inconsistencies, not because she was cynical, but because she was no longer willing to betray herself in order to keep a fantasy alive. That is a form of restoration many people overlook. When truth has done its work in you, you do not merely become less vulnerable to one harmful person. You become more able to recognize what honors life and what feeds on it. God restores boundaries that way too. Not as walls of bitterness, but as expressions of dignity. Before, Sophia had often thought of boundaries as something severe, almost unkind, because her pain had trained her to associate self-protection with guilt. But restoration changed the meaning of no. No longer sounded cruel. It sounded clean. It sounded like alignment. It sounded like self-respect in plain language. She no longer felt responsible for carrying another person's emotional chaos in order to prove she was loving. She no longer felt obligated to over-explain her limits so they would seem acceptable. She learned that healthy love does not need endless access to remain love. It only needs truth, respect, and mutual regard. This changed her relationships in ways she had not expected. Not all at once, but gradually, the quality of her life began improving because the quality of what she permitted began changing. She reconnected with old friends without the old anxious undertow. She laughed more naturally. She stopped scanning every silence for danger. She began going on morning walks by the lake with no soundtrack at all, just the wind, the water, and the sound of her own unhurried footsteps. She started reading again, not to escape herself, but to meet herself in language that did not distort her. She cooked meals without that familiar knot in her chest. She slept more deeply. She noticed beauty more easily. These things sound ordinary until you remember what it feels like to lose access to them. Then they become evidence of resurrection. Because that is what God restores too, your capacity for simple life. Narcissistic harm often makes life feel like an emergency even when nothing is happening. It teaches the body to remain alert, the mind to remain defensive, the heart to remain prepared for injury. When truth begins restoring a person, that emergency state slowly loosens. You begin to inhabit your own days again. You stop living as if peace were suspicious. You stop bracing against tenderness. You stop assuming every good thing is temporary bait before disappointment. Your nervous system starts learning a new theology: safety is possible, steadiness is possible, joy is possible, and none of these require illusion to exist. Sophia also discovered that God restores dignity in a way the world rarely understands. Dignity is not loud. It does not announce itself with superiority. It is not the same as proving someone wrong or being publicly vindicated. Dignity is the return of inner authority. It is the moment you stop trying to convince people of your worth and start living from it. It is when your voice no longer trembles because it is begging to be believed. It becomes calmer because it has stopped negotiating with falsehood. There is enormous freedom in that. The narcissist once had power partly because your reality was still entangled with their response to it. But when dignity is restored, that entanglement weakens. You stop borrowing identity from those who never had the integrity to guard it. And perhaps most beautiful of all, God restores tenderness without naivety. This may be one of the rarest forms of healing. Many people can become harder after betrayal. Fewer become wiser without becoming colder. Sophia feared for a while that healing would mean losing something precious in herself forever. She feared she would never again love with warmth, trust with openness, or hope without calculation. But restoration did not erase her tenderness. It purified it. It removed the compulsion from it, the self-betrayal from it, the fantasy from it. What remained was not less love, but truer love. Not less empathy, but empathy with wisdom. Not less openness, but openness with discernment. That is a miracle in its own right. Because the final insult of narcissistic harm is not only that it injures you. It tries to make you ashamed of your own goodness. It tries to teach you that your best qualities caused your pain. But God restores those qualities differently. He does not return them to you in their former innocence. He returns them with strength. Your kindness is no longer blind. Your compassion is no longer cheaply available. Your loyalty is no longer disconnected from truth. Your love is no longer willing to kneel before confusion. That is restoration. Not becoming who you were before. Becoming someone deeper, steadier, and more whole because truth was allowed to finish its work in you. Sophia once believed healing would mean getting back what she had lost. But in time she realized something greater was happening. She was not merely recovering old ground. She was receiving something she did not yet have before the wound, a clearer mind, a stronger spirit, cleaner boundaries, a more rooted relationship to truth, and a life no longer built around being chosen by those who could not honor her. That is what God does in the person who chooses truth. He does not only comfort what was broken. He rebuilds it in a form that deception can no longer easily enter. And that kind of restoration is not just survival. It is a new beginning made sacred by everything that tried and failed to destroy it. The awakening, when the empath stops living in the fog. The awakening does not begin with confidence. It begins with exhaustion. Not ordinary exhaustion. Not the kind that sleep fixes. Not the kind a weekend away can soften. It begins when the soul grows so tired of bending around distortion that it can no longer pretend confusion is normal. It begins when the cost of staying in the fog becomes greater than the fear of finally seeing clearly. That is the real threshold. Not when the narcissist changes. Not when they confess. Not when the outside world catches up. The awakening begins when something inside the empath quietly says, I cannot keep living like this and still call it love. That was the turning point for Sophia. Chicago had witnessed all of her stages by then. The disbelief. The grief. The self-doubt. The long private effort to remain fair, to remain gentle, to keep looking for an explanation that would make the whole thing less devastating than it was. She had done what so many deeply empathetic people do. She had overinterpreted his pain, underinterpreted her own, and tried to make meaning out of behavior that was never meant to be understood honestly. She had searched for hidden wounds in him while ignoring the open wound in herself. She had given complexity the benefit of the doubt long after complexity had become a cover for harm. That is often how the empath survives at first. Not by seeing clearly, but by feeling deeply and then using that depth against themselves. Because empaths do not merely hear words. They hear tones, silences, fractures, histories, possibilities. They sense contradictions. They feel what is unsaid. They recognize pain in others before those others have language for it. This is a beautiful human capacity when joined to wisdom. But without clarity, it becomes dangerous. It turns perception into over-responsibility. It turns compassion into accommodation. It turns hope into denial. The empath begins explaining away what should have been faced directly, all because their heart keeps insisting there must be one more layer, one more reason, one more hidden wound that justifies one more chance. That is the fog. The fog is not simply confusion. It is moral and emotional overextension. It is what happens when empathy loses contact with truth. It is the state in which your heart keeps trying to rescue what your soul has already recognized as unsafe. It is the place where you continue offering understanding to someone who uses understanding as cover. And over time, the fog does something terrifying: it makes self-betrayal feel compassionate. Sophia lived there longer than she wanted to admit. She called it patience. She called it nuance. She called it being mature, being loyal, being the kind of person who does not give up on people too easily. But awakening required a more brutal honesty than that. It required her to ask questions that did not flatter her self-image. Why did I stay so long after my spirit had already begun withdrawing? Why did I keep calling my endurance love when much of it was fear? Why did I ignore the ache in my own body every time something in me knew this was wrong? Why did I keep trying to be understood by someone who benefited from my confusion? Those questions are painful because they strip away fantasy, and fantasy is often what keeps an empath emotionally alive inside a damaging bond. The fantasy that the person could become who they almost seem to be. The fantasy that one more honest conversation could unlock accountability. The fantasy that enough love, enough softness, enough spiritual maturity, enough sacrifice could redeem the pattern. Letting that fantasy die feels like grief because it is grief. You are not only losing the person. You are losing the future you built around their potential. You are losing the story that made your suffering seem meaningful. This is why awakening feels so violent at first, even though it is the beginning of freedom. You are not waking up into comfort. You are waking up into truth. And truth, at the beginning, can feel merciless. It asks you to stop romanticizing your capacity to endure what should have ended sooner. It asks you to stop confusing your empathy with obligation. It asks you to admit that not every act of staying is noble, and not every act of leaving is selfish. It asks you to grieve not just what was done to you, but the ways you participated in your own erasure by continuing to negotiate with what your deepest instincts had already rejected. But that is where the light begins entering. Because the moment an empath stops lying to themselves, the narcissist begins losing one of their greatest sources of power. The narcissist thrives in ambiguity. They need the other person to remain divided. Divided between what they feel and what they permit. Between what they know and what they say out loud. Between their private intuition and their public explanations. As long as that division remains, control remains possible. But awakening reunites those split parts. The empath begins to feel and name, see and act, discern and refuse. The inner world starts coming back into alignment. And alignment is deadly to manipulation. Sophia did not awaken because she suddenly became cold. She awakened because she became honest. She stopped asking, "What if I'm being too harsh?" And began asking, "Why have I been so willing to be harsh with myself?" She stopped asking, "How do I make him understand?" And began asking, "Why do I keep believing understanding is his goal?" She stopped interpreting every moment through his wounds and started interpreting the pattern through its impact. This was the beginning of clarity, and clarity changes everything. Because clarity is not just intellectual recognition. It is spiritual reorganization. It is when the fog lifts not because the narcissist finally tells the truth, but because you stop borrowing your reality from someone committed to distorting it. That is one of the most powerful shifts a human being can experience. You no longer need their admission in order to trust your own perception. You no longer need a final conversation to validate what the pattern has already shown. You no longer need to win the argument because you are no longer trapped inside the argument as the measure of reality. Something steadier takes its place. A calm, interior authority. Not dramatic. Not cruel. Just clean. From there, boundaries stop feeling like punishment and start feeling like sanity. Conscious detachment stops feeling like abandonment and starts feeling like respect for your own life. Silence stops feeling like helplessness and starts feeling like the refusal to keep feeding confusion with your energy. This is why the awakened empath unsettles the narcissist so deeply. Not because the empath becomes aggressive, but because they become unavailable to distortion. They stop over-explaining. They stop defending themselves in circles. They stop trying to rescue the image of the person who harmed them. They stop volunteering their tenderness to someone who only knows how to metabolize it as leverage. Their calm becomes difficult to control. Their clarity becomes difficult to gaslight. Their distance becomes impossible to reinterpret as emotional dependence. Sophia felt this change first in very small moments. In the pause before replying. In the absence of panic where panic used to live. In the way her body no longer begged her to fix every misunderstanding immediately. In the way she could sit alone in her apartment with the city lights beyond the glass and feel grief without feeling compelled to turn grief into re-engagement. That was new. That was sacred. For the first time, she was no longer living at the mercy of the fog. And once that happens, you cannot fully go back. Because awakening is not a mood. It is a crossing. You begin to see how often you called chaos chemistry, how often you named emotional deprivation depth, how often you mistook your ability to carry pain for proof that you were meant to carry it. You begin to understand that empathy without wisdom becomes self-abandonment, and love without clarity becomes self-betrayal. You stop wearing confusion as a badge of loyalty. You stop making a home in interpretation. You stop trying to earn peace from a pattern that depends on your inner instability. That is when the empath truly begins to return. Not to innocence. Not to who they were before. But to a wiser self, a clearer self, a self no longer hypnotized by possibility at the expense of reality. And that is the moment the narcissist begins losing access to the place they once controlled most easily. Not your schedule. Not your words. Not even your heart. Your mind. In the end, God does not need your revenge. In the end, God does not need your revenge because God is not confused by what confused you. That may be one of the hardest truths to accept when you have been wounded by a narcissist. Not because it is untrue, but because pain makes the heart impatient. Pain wants movement. Pain wants response. Pain wants something visible enough to match the invisible violence that was done to you. When you have been lied to, diminished, emotionally cornered, or forced to carry the weight of someone else's distortion, something inside you naturally cries out for balance. You want the story corrected. You want the scales restored. You want the one who played with your reality to finally stand inside a reality they cannot control. That desire is deeply human. Sophia knew that desire well. There were nights in Chicago when the city seemed too alive for the kind of grief she was carrying. The traffic below her apartment window moved with indifferent rhythm. Somewhere, people were laughing over drinks. Somewhere, music was spilling out onto sidewalks. Somewhere, he was likely moving through the same city with that same practiced face, that same voice, that same ability to remain socially intact while she was still rebuilding parts of herself he had helped unravel. And in those moments, the ache for revenge did not feel petty. It felt moral. It felt like a protest rising from the deepest part of her being. Not just because she wanted him to hurt, but because she wanted the truth to matter. That is where many people become divided inside. They know bitterness will not heal them, and yet they cannot pretend they do not long for justice. They know revenge can poison the soul, and yet something in them still wants to witness consequence with their own eyes. They do not want to become cruel. They just do not want evil to look effective. They do not want manipulation to appear rewarded. They do not want tenderness to feel foolish. This is why the final lesson is so important. God does not need your revenge because revenge is too small for what was actually violated. Revenge usually aims at pain. It wants to inflict, embarrass, expose, humiliate, destabilize. It is a human attempt to make the other person feel what they made you feel. But what happened between you and a narcissist was never only about pain. It was about truth. It was about conscience. It was about the misuse of trust, the corruption of closeness, the desecration of what should have been handled with care. And because the injury was deeper than the event, the answer must be deeper too. God does not merely answer wounds by returning them in equal measure. God answers at the level of reality. That is why divine justice does not always satisfy the imagination at first. The imagination wants scenes. It wants spectacle. It wants the moment of collapse, the public confession, the visible reversal. But God is not performing for the wounded ego, even when the wound itself is real and severe. God is restoring order. God is bringing things back into alignment with what they actually are. And that kind of justice is slower, quieter, more exact, and more complete than revenge could ever be. Sophia began to understand this only when she stopped making her healing dependent on seeing the ending with her own eyes. That was a painful surrender. It meant accepting that she might never get the apology that fit the damage. She might never hear him name the pattern honestly. She might never watch the full unraveling happen in a form that looked satisfying to the part of her that still wanted proof. But surrendering that need did not make her weaker. It made her freer. Because the need to witness punishment can become its own kind of prison. It can chain your future to the person who wounded your past. It can make your peace dependent on their downfall rather than your restoration. And that is too much power to leave in the hands of someone who already took too much. There is a sacred release that happens when a person finally says, I no longer need to carry out what truth itself is already capable of doing. That release is not denial. It is not passivity. It is not spiritual bypassing. It is not pretending that evil is acceptable or harmless. It is the mature recognition that reality does not require your obsession in order to remain real. You do not have to become consumed by correction for truth to keep working. You do not have to ruin your nervous system trying to force exposure on your own timetable for consequence to still unfold. This is what Sophia discovered in the quiet aftermath of survival. The more she healed, the less interested she became in theatrical endings. Not because what happened mattered less, but because she was finally beginning to live somewhere deeper than reaction. She started noticing a new kind of strength forming in her. Not the strength of indifference. Not the strength of pretending she had never loved, never trusted, never broken. Something better than that. She was becoming a person who no longer needed to argue with distortion in order to belong to truth. She no longer needed every false narrative corrected in real time to know who she was. She no longer needed to win the moral performance of the situation because she had stepped out of performance altogether. That is one of the quiet miracles of choosing truth. It gives you back your life without requiring the offender's cooperation. And once that begins, revenge starts to look different. Smaller. More frantic. More expensive. You realize that revenge keeps you psychologically tied to the same system you are trying to escape. It forces you to keep facing the person through the lens of unfinished business. It makes your healing conditional. It whispers that peace can wait until they pay. But if peace waits for that, then peace is still under their control. God does not need your revenge because God does not need to borrow the methods of the broken in order to establish justice. God is not scrambling. God is not anxious. God is not trying to catch up to what happened to you. The narcissist did not outmaneuver truth. They did not outsmart consequence. They did not build a private world so sophisticated that moral reality can no longer enter. No. What they built carries within itself the seeds of its own undoing. And what you are building, if you remain aligned with what is true, carries within it the seeds of restoration. That is the great divergence. One path keeps resisting reality until reality becomes unbearable. The other path grieves reality, accepts it, and is slowly transformed by it. Sophia could not have seen this clearly in the beginning. The beginning was too raw. The beginning was still full of the shock of being violated without visible proof. But by the end, she understood something she had not known when the story first shattered open inside her. Justice was never only about what happened to him. It was also about what happened to her. It was about whether she would remain trapped in the psychic courtroom of his distortion, or whether she would return to a life built on something he could never give and could never take away. It was about whether the final chapter would be written by injury or by truth. And truth writes differently than revenge. Truth does not always rush. Truth does not always explain itself on demand. Truth does not always arrive in the dramatic form your pain would have preferred. But truth is faithful. It keeps working in silence. It keeps clearing what lies tried to cloud. It keeps exposing what masks tried to hide. It keeps restoring what manipulation tried to fragment. It keeps making a way for the wounded to become whole without becoming false. That is why, in the end, God does not need your revenge. Because revenge is still about them. Truth is finally about what is real. And what is real is this: what they did mattered. What it cost you mattered. The confusion was real. The grief was real. The desecration was real. But it was not final. Their version of the story was not final. Their image was not final. Their control was not final. Even your pain, terrible as it was not final. God's answer is larger than your urge to strike back. His answer is the exposure of falsehood, the unraveling of illusion, the weight of consequence, the restoration of your inner life, and the quiet, unshakable freedom of no longer needing darkness to admit what light already knows. Sophia did not get every answer. She got something better. She got herself back. And that is how you know God has begun to finish what revenge never could. Sophia's story is, in many ways, the story of what happens when a sincere heart collides with a carefully constructed illusion. At the beginning, she did not recognize the danger because it did not arrive looking dangerous. It arrived looking composed, persuasive, and emotionally intelligent. It arrived wrapped in calm language, selective tenderness, and just enough charm to make her question her own discomfort. And that is what made the wound so devastating. She was not only hurt by what was said or done to her. She was slowly pulled away from her own inner certainty. Her trust was used against her. Her empathy was stretched until it became self-betrayal. Her patience became the space in which distortion kept growing. Like so many people who have been entangled with a narcissistic person, Sophia did not simply lose peace. She lost clarity, self-trust, and the quiet ease of being at home inside her own mind. But that is not where the story ended. What makes Sophia's journey powerful is that she did not stay trapped inside confusion forever. She began to see that what looked like strength in the narcissist was often just performance under pressure. What looked like untouchable confidence was frequently a fragile system built on control, external validation, and the manipulation of perception. Slowly, painfully, she came to understand that the damage done to her was not her fault, but healing from it would require her participation. She had to stop waiting for the narcissist to tell the truth before she could live by it. She had to stop making her peace dependent on his exposure, his apology, or his collapse. She had to choose truth before she had proof that justice would be visible. That was the turning point. Instead of becoming colder, more deceptive, and more bitter, she chose to become clearer. Instead of becoming what hurt her, she chose integrity. Instead of chasing revenge, she let truth, time, and consequence do their deeper work. And through that process, God restored what manipulation had tried to destroy. He restored her discernment, her dignity, her boundaries, her inner authority, and eventually her capacity to love life again without abandoning herself. The deepest lesson from Sophia's story is this: pain can either deform your character or deepen it, and the difference often lies in whether you choose truth when bitterness feels easier. If you have been hurt by someone narcissistic, your first instinct may be to prove, expose, retaliate, or obsess over when they will finally face consequences. Those reactions are human. But lasting freedom begins when you stop building your future around their downfall and start rebuilding your own inner life. In practical terms, that means listening to your body when something feels wrong instead of overriding it. It means setting boundaries without over-explaining. It means journaling, therapy, prayer, rest, honest friendships, and moments of stillness that reconnect you to your own mind. It means learning that empathy without wisdom becomes self-destruction, while empathy with clarity becomes strength. Most of all, it means understanding that your healing is not a side note to the story. It is the story. The narcissist may have shaped a chapter, but they do not get the final word unless you hand it to them. Truth gets the final word. God gets the final word. And when you stay aligned with what is real, even through grief, you begin to recover something more valuable than revenge, a life that is no longer ruled by fear, confusion, or the need to be understood by those who never intended to understand you. Disclaimer: this video is for reference and knowledge-sharing purposes only. It is not a substitute for professional diagnosis, therapy, or mental health treatment from a licensed psychologist, psychiatrist, or qualified mental health professional. Now here is a quick question for you. Which do you think is the real turning point in healing from a narcissistic relationship? A. When the narcissist finally faces visible consequences. B. When you stop waiting for them to change and start reclaiming yourself. Comment A or B below. And I would really love to hear your perspective too. What part of Sophia's journey resonated with you the most, and why? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn from your experience as well. If this message spoke to you, subscribe to the channel and support the journey so we can keep creating deeper, more healing content like this.